Adam, we talk a lot about the DFS, and I say it with the air quote out there, the kind of pick'em game DFS stuff that is going on. And, I think a lot of people think like, dude, you guys are obsessed. Well, no, I mean, news stories continue to pop up. And listen, when the American Gaming Association goes and they say something to the entire industry, which is a state of the industry address that happened this past Tuesday, and they actually speak out about this, it is a news story. And so it is, incumbent upon us to report on these things. It is not our role to make those determinations, but we continue to encourage regulators to be vigilant to ensure DFS products don't cross the line into sports betting. Now, this is the senior vice president of the government relations for the AGA. It's been encouraging to see regulators in almost a dozen states look at this issue and determine that actions are warranted to protect the integrity of their marketplaces. And, Adam, at the end of the day, right? I mean, some of this stuff, like, yeah, you and I are a little bit on the side of, look, just call a spade, and then maybe we can at least come around to your side at least a little bit more and talk to you about these things. But the other thing that is a real issue, we've already seen it happen a couple of different times, and anyone that has lived through this the internet gaming era, and that's starting way back in online poker, going into regular DFS and all the things, that the reason that we look at this stuff is you go in, you get licensed to become a sports book. There's a barrier to entry. You have to pay a fee up front. You have to do all that. And a lot of that isn't necessarily even for the fact of like, oh, we're going to make the state rich or whatever. Some of these fees are $500K. Some of these fees are $200K, whatever it might be. It's to make sure that you have enough money to operate as a company and that you are a legitimate company and you don't become insolvent and you don't leave players hanging and all the different stuff like that. And so, it's not only the AGA saying like, let's look at how these games are structured, but it's also, again, they talk about the integrity and all of that of what's going on, because as consumers, you and I, if I put my deposit in at a site and I go and hit withdraw, I want to know with some level of certainty that I'm going to be able to withdraw the funds that I put on this. And we've actually seen a couple of these sites kind of go away, poof, middle of the night, oh, money's gone type stuff. And all of that plays into why we continue to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you laid out a pretty good justification for why we're so vigilant on this story, because this is probably the biggest talker within the broader sports betting and DFS industry right now. It's the story that everyone is discussing, not just because we're somehow pushing the agenda. There's just a lot of activity when it comes to regulators and when it comes to what people are discussing at industry conferences and so on, when it comes to, and again, you said with the air quotes, I'll use the word that the AGA used in its address, faux, as in F-A-U-X, faux daily fantasy sports was the reference that the AGA made to companies like PrizePicks, Underdog, Better, and essentially to the pick'em games that mirror player props. The point in all of this is that when we discuss these stories, what we're discussing is a factual recitation of what state regulators are discussing. That's it. We're talking about the letters that are going out from state regulators, which happened very recently, by the way, since we last talked to you over the last couple of weeks, in Kansas, in Arkansas, in Florida, and now we are seeing further action being prepared in Massachusetts. And in New York, we saw PrizePicks fined $15 million and ultimately ceasing operations in the state. This is a broad issue at the moment. And what we're seeing, quite interestingly, is that the week after the Super Bowl is when we saw a lot of these enforcement actions come around. And Matt, it's not a coincidence by any stretch of the imagination that that's when it happened, and that we have not seen the same level of pushback from the fantasy sports operators the week after football season that we saw during football season, because that is obviously the number one acquisition and revenue opportunity for them is during football season. So you talk about the importance of the story. It is February 21st when we record this. By the time next February 21st gets here, I guarantee you we are going to be having more discussion about bans, about rule changes, about court cases, et cetera, because the way we've seen this trend the online sports betting operators, and again, DraftKings, FanDuel, some others are part of the American Gaming Association, it's been clear that they see this as competition that is not on the same footing, as you mentioned, as what they are dealing with, right? That these companies are either operating in states where sports betting is not available and not under any regulation, or they're offering what appear to be competing products in certain states that do have sports betting legalized. And those regulators are now taking a much closer look at what the competing product looks like and saying, you are offering, in some cases, illegal gambling, in some cases, things that mirror gambling, whatever the case might be. We've seen a great number of state regulators say that the pick'em product too closely mirrors sports betting and needs to be adjusted. Now, some states have done that, right? To go back, Colorado came to an agreement with the fantasy sports operators and said, fine, we can do pick'em, but it can't be 2 or more. It has to be 4 or more. Mm-hmm. And if it's going to be 4 or more, it has to be based only on the fantasy points that these players score versus the traditional stats that are used in props. So we're not saying that there's not a place. Clearly, there can be a place. If the rules change, there can be a place within those rules. Even in under current rules, like in Colorado, there can be a place. But what is happening right now is that we are seeing more and more of state regulators having questions about the viability of these products under current laws and regulations.
Yeah, and this isn't to say, look, the market leaders, I'm fairly confident in the fact that, that's from the legal standpoint. I'm like from the consumer standpoint, the stuff that I mentioned earlier. Look, the market leaders, there's no reason for me to believe that, Prize Picks and Underdog don't have a ton of money. I imagine that they do, and there's absolutely there's nothing that you and I would be materially concerned about, from a consumer perspective of like, oh, I put in my $500, I'm trying to withdraw my $500 and it's not there anymore. But we have seen some of these sites be fly by night, kind of come and go. And the thing is when there's not proper, vetting in place for all of these, when they're operating in this weird area, is it sports betting? Is it DFS? Are they in gray markets where there's no DFS laws that is anyway? And all of that. That's when we really kind of open the door for bad things to happen. And, we've had a couple of stories about those already of sites having to fold and go under and, what's going on. How did this happen in the first place? And it's just because it's easy. I don't want to call them scams or a scheme or whatever, but like, Adam, it's easy to kind of get something started and realize you don't know how to run it. And the next thing you know, you don't have any money left. And it's like, these aren't, sometimes these things aren't necessarily real businesses. They're just ideas that get thrown together by people who are good at building an app and can, put some ads on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and this, that, and the other. And you get enough mass to have a little run at it for a little while. And then the next thing you know, you look up and you're like, oh, darn, all the money in the account is gone. And so, there's not only the legal aspect to all this, but there is a consumer aspect to all this as well, which is why there just needs to be some clarification. All we're asking for literally is just clarification in all of this.
And yeah, and if you're wondering to the point of what Matt is talking about, go check out Mike Mazzio's reporting on No House Advantage at Legal Sports Report, one of these smaller operators that disappeared sort of in the middle of the night and people were not able to get their money back. They're not the only ones. They just happen to be the ones that we've reported on most extensively at LSR. And Matt, look, it goes back to the same thing we've talked about, whether we're talking about online sports betting, whether we're talking about fantasy sports. If we're going to talk about consumer protections, I can tell you about a podcast that I listen to regularly where you've got a couple of guys who bet not only in the legal market, but still bet offshore. And they're talking extensively about how they have to think about how and when they bet offshore based on the timing of the price of Bitcoin. Right? I mean, that is not a consumer protected element. We know the volatility of Bitcoin as a currency. And if you're going to go and bet offshore, not only are you risking the fact that, like you said, Matt, it is the laws and regulations of another country that you are not protected under here in the United States, but most of the offshores are now paying you out in a currency that is not stable like the U.S. dollar. So you have other concerns to think about as well, no matter what kind of gambling or game of skill, chance, whatever you choose to engage in online.